The Chinese tech giant Huawei is suing the American government for violating the Constitution and banning it from entering the U.S. market. The chances are said to be small for Huawei to win, but is it worth a fight? And in our continuing series looking at topics being discussed by the two sessions in Beijing, today we'll be looking at the environment. Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Following the Huawei CFO's lawsuit against the Canadian government, the Chinese tech giant announced on Thursday it is now suing the U.S. government. The company claims a law limiting its U.S. business violates the U.S. Constitution. The target of Huawei is Section 889 of the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, which was signed into law by U.S. President Donald Trump last August. Under this act, the U.S. Congress prohibited federal agencies and their contractors from cooperating with Huawei or companies that use Huawei equipment. The lawsuit has been filed in a federal court in Texas. At a press conference on Thursday, Huawei's rotating chairman Guo Ping again dismissed the allegation against it over national security risks, saying Huawei is left with no choice but to challenge the law in court. On what basis is the company seeking to overturn the ban? What are the chances that it wins the case, and does it matter? Joining me from Washington, D.C. is Douglas Smith, former Assistant Secretary of U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and from Hong Kong, Professor David Law at the University of Hong Kong. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Professor Law, you are a legal expert, so help us understand the basis of Huawei's claim here.
Sure. So this is a federal statute, as you mentioned, and one of the provisions forbids U.S. agencies from contracting with Huawei. And Huawei argues that this provision is unconstitutional for three reasons. First, they argue that it amounts to a bill of attainder. That is a constitutional prohibition against laws that impose criminal punishment without a trial. They also argue that this is a violation of the separation of powers, that Congress lacks the power to legislatively adjudicate whether Huawei is collaborating with the Chinese government or is otherwise compromising security. And they finally argue that they're being denied equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment on the basis that they are being singled out for unfair and unfavorable treatment. Those are the three constitutional arguments they've made.
All right. So some people are saying there is almost zero chance for Huawei to win this case, or I understand you have said that this case would even go to trial, let alone the judge handing Huawei a win. What are your arguments? Why do you say so?
Well, I think first what I think will happen is the judge will say, even if all of the facts that Huawei is alleging in its complaint are true, as a matter of law, there's no legal basis for these claims. The major problem here is there was a similar lawsuit brought by a Russian software company, Kaspersky. The U.S. government doesn't want to be using its software either, and it lost that lawsuit. The problem here is that if the U.S. government refuses to buy from a particular company, that's not a form of criminal punishment. You know, every government in the world, every company has a preferred vendor list. And so Huawei is basically trying to argue, well, you've left us off your preferred vendor list. You've said that you're not going to buy from us, but that's not criminal punishment. So the Bill of Attainder Clause argument doesn't really work. The separation of powers argument doesn't really work either, because Congress legislatively finds all kinds of facts all the time. So, for example, if the Congress decides not to buy any more fighter jets from General Dynamics, because it thinks that General Dynamics products are poor quality, General Dynamics is not entitled to a trial on the question of whether its products or its fighter jets are of good quality. Likewise, if Congress decides not to spend money on Huawei because it thinks Huawei is collaborating with the Chinese government, Huawei is not entitled to a trial on the question of whether it's collaborating.
Okay, I get your point,
does this all the time.
Professor Law. Yeah, I get your point. But basically what you're saying is Huawei, whether or not it has been fairly treated according to common sense, although it has there's no public evidence that it has violated the U.S. national security interest or anybody else's, that there has been a good track record. Despite all of that, Huawei has no chance. If you were the company of Huawei, what would you do? Professor Law, very briefly, and I'll go to Mr. Smith in D.C.
Well, I think it makes sense as a public relations move. The very fact that we're talking about this lawsuit right now, it creates the impression that Huawei has some sort of a legal objection to what the U.S. government is doing. But when the Chinese government decides that it doesn't want to buy Japanese cars for its government officials to use, no one says that's unconstitutional. If the U.S. government wants to itself buy American, it's U.S. taxpayer money, and
I'm going
if they don't want to spend U.S.
I
taxpayer money.
I know. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. Okay, Mr. Smith in D.C.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, Professor, amazing description. Thank you for that. Very interesting. I think it goes against a bigger backdrop of the ongoing political battle between D.C. and Beijing as it relates to trade wars. And I think the challenge right now is Chinese exports are down 21%. I think the U.S. government, as the professor so eloquently said, they can choose who they buy from, when they buy from, and at what cost they pay. And so I think I get why they're pushing back. They have no other option. It's a big market here. They want to be in it. They want to be in chips. They want to be distributed. But the suit's not really going to have a particularly sympathetic year, particularly in this climate of a trade war that our president is pushing so aggressively. So while I applaud their attempt, I think, as they say here, it will fall on deaf ears.
Is it worth a fight, though? I mean, okay, I get your point. Every government can decide whether they buy from a certain company or not. But again, is there a line where they have to observe some kind of rule here too? It's not that if the government wants to do anything, they can just go ahead and do it. In China, we have this ability where people, if they do not agree with any executive directive from the government, they can ask for the government to take it back or correct what it does. Mr. Smith.
Right. I think, unfortunately, in this current climate, this approach is definitely not going to work. I mean, this.
So you're saying this is a
political. Here
there's a big political.
I think there are significant. Well, there's significant national security implications behind the scenes, but if they truly want to try to have their day in court, pardon the pun, I don't think in the current political environment this is the way to go. I mean, this is a current administration that is, has a propensity to definitely go the opposite direction they want to go, and when they put their backs up against the wall, they only swing back that much harder. We've seen that, when Donald Trump tried on his travel ban and a variety of other issues. And so while I understand it, they want their chips and their equipment to be able to be used and sold in the United States.
So
I think the reality situation is the political climate is just never going to support their approach right now.
So basically, power is being abused, you're saying, for political gains or economic gains? Mr.
No, not at all. I mean, as the professor so eloquently said, I mean, the U.S. government can choose to buy whoever they want to buy from. I mean, much like the Chinese government, the Japanese government. If the U.S. wants to, buy a certain kind of car, of Kleenex, of a wrench to use on a naval ship, it's completely up to them. So it's not that any power is being abused at all.
I don't think any government in the world can do whatever they want. There's got to be a line. There are WTO obligations. There are
as it relates to purchasing,
let me go to Professor Law here. Professor Law.
As it relates to purchasing, I have to respectfully push back. As it relates to purchasing, they absolutely can. Like, no one tells you what kind of peanut butter to buy. You choose the product you want to buy. And if the U.S. government chooses to not buy a product, it's totally within their means.
Okay,
they're
Professor
not
Law,
telling the company to go out of business. They're just not buying it.
Okay, Professor Law.
So there are a couple of narrow exceptions to the idea that the government can spend, when it's government's dime, they can spend on whoever they want. For example, if the government were to say, well, we're not going to spend money on Huawei because its CEO is Buddhist. Well, that would be religious discrimination. Religious, racial discrimination, a few types of discrimination receive very close scrutiny from the courts. But here, if the reason is national security, that's not the kind of discrimination.
Okay, now that you mentioned this, Professor Law, sorry to interrupt you. I have really limited time. I want to tell this. On Thursday, U.S. State Department Deputy Spokesperson Robert Palladino said, "We believe," in reaction to Huawei's lawsuit, he said that we believe that these risks posed by vendors subject to extrajudicial or unchecked compulsion by foreign states that do not share our values need to be weighed rigorously before making procurement decisions on these technologies. So is there some kind of discrimination based on ideology here, Professor Law?
Well, the problem is that almost every law discriminates in some way. For example, if you say that you can't park on Sundays, you're discriminating against certain drivers who want to park on Sundays. If you say that you have to drive a car with the steering wheel on the right-hand side, you're discriminating against people who own cars with steering wheels on the left-hand side. What the courts have said in the United States is a constitutional matter. Only certain forms of discrimination receive close scrutiny. So if it's racial or ethnic or a religious discrimination, or to some extent gender or age discrimination, maybe
but
the
not
courts will look more
ideological
closely at that.
discrimination.
Not ideological. There's no such thing in constitutional jurisprudence as
Is there
ideological
such thing as
discrimination.
ideological discrimination? I think probably we should talk about that. Mr. Smith, maybe.
Well, legally it hasn't been recognized.
Professor Law, yeah. Okay, legally I believe that right now there is no such term, but is there some kind of ideological discrimination at play here, Mr. Smith?
Well, I think it breaks down to how you're defining ideology, and I think, and not to speak for the spokesperson of the State Department, I would suspect that what they were implying was political ideologies, or the views of the agendas of the Chinese government, and nothing to do with the religious, sexual, et cetera, as Professor Law so eloquently said. So, I think this is a decision based, in fact, on national security threats that they perceive. And what I believe the State Department spokesperson was inarticulately trying to discuss was the ideology of sort of going against U.S. interests, U.S. Political, U.S. security interests.
I don't know.
That word, I believe that's probably what he's probably.
That is.
And as I said, I don't want to speak for
Mm-hmm.
them, not particularly articulate the way they described it, but that would be my assumption.
But that is the perception, let me say, the perception of the ideology of harming U.S. interests, because I don't think it is in China's belief or interest to harm U.S. interests actively, and I don't think it is in Russia. But what we have discovered, especially in recent years, such mistrust, this mutual finger pointing, this guessing and confrontation, and using executive order or legal means to, under the context of national security, to ban or to keep companies out, is on the rise in the United States. Is it because of President Trump? Mr. Smith?
Look, I think President Trump definitely has his perspective on a lot of these things. I think this case is a little bit unique. The one thing I would say that, and while I understand fully the threats and concerns they see on the national security front, the one thing I would say is a little surprising is, given the delicacy of the trade agreements they're trying to negotiate with Beijing, that I'm sort of surprised that the President Trump's administration hasn't tried a slightly more discreet hand in handling this. But I think we've seen in the 2 years that they're in there, there's nothing discreet about this administration. They come out pretty aggressively on all fronts, and that in this particular case, that's how they're handling it.
Okay, I'm going to play out this soundbite from China's State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, not so much legal, but rather on diplomacy. Let's take a listen to this very quickly.
Some individuals vow to decouple our economies. This is just their wishful thinking. Decoupling from China would mean decoupling from opportunities, from the future, and in a sense, even from the world.
Okay, I'm not talking about if Huawei loses the case or wins the case, that means the decoupling between China and the United States. But in the sense, there is this kind of perception or talk of hawkish people in the United States thinking or talking of decoupling the two economies. Professor Law, what is your take of the consequence if the ban stays for the United States?
Well, I think what are the consequences for the United States? I think the consequences are probably fairly limited. There are other vendors out there that are willing and able to sell equipment, would be delighted to sell to the United States. I'm sure Samsung would be very happy
to
pick up
price.
that government business in the U.S. Possibly, but Samsung, there are also other American companies as well that could do this. So there are multiple vendors, right? I mean, granted, there aren't a million companies that do this, but there's more than one.
Okay. Let's wait and see what happens. Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us today. Douglas Smith, former Assistant Secretary of U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and from Hong Kong, Professor David Law at the University of Hong Kong.